The honourable member from Charlottetown, Belvedere.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, and speak to the 2021 capital budget. Mr. Speaker, a budget is probably the single most important tool that a government has to make change. It indicates how the government of the day will divide up the limited resources of our province, and it shows us where that government's priorities lie. The budget has a real impact on the lives of islanders, but it is also inherently a highly political document, so it's important to take any budget with a grain of salt. With this government's track record of failures and misplaced priorities, Mr. Speaker, it's probably more like a pound of road salt. Since the Conservatives came to power, what we've seen is a government that consistently overpromises and underdelivers. They're all talk and no action, and islanders are running out of patience. Let's start with health, Mr. Speaker. Improving healthcare was supposed to be one of the top priorities for this government, and it certainly is a top priority for islanders. Take the promise for the new mental health hospital, which went from shovels in the ground on day one to we're still years away and we can't even keep up with the previous government's plan. Into the third year of its mandate, this government has been utterly incapable of following through on this key promise. Either that, or they made a promise to islanders that they had no intention of keeping. This government ran on a platform promising to expedite the construction of the new mental health hospital. In my experience, Mr. Speaker, expedite usually means faster, not slower. But today, this capital budget confirms that this government cannot even meet the timeline proposed by the previous Liberal government. A mental health campus is admittedly a big, complex project, which one might expect could run into delays. But this government can't even seem to roll out simple programs properly. Upgrades to the current Hillsborough Hospital ventilation system were in our budget asks. At minimum, I hope we're going to see some air conditioning. Is that too complicated? Expanding dental services in response to a request from the official opposition was approved in the 2020 budget, but the rollout of these services were delayed multiple times, first until spring 2021, then July, then finally in October. The first few patients have begun receiving support. This was a relatively simple program with the full and enthusiastic support of the PEI dental professionals and the public. So I'd hate to see how this government manages a difficult file. We're seeing the same thing with midwifery services. Islanders were promised midwives would be practicing in January 2020, and then it was February 2021. And here we are 2 years from the original start date, and we're still a year out. Mobile mental health units, first to launch in January 21, actual launch October. We are happy, however, to see some signs of life when it comes to medical neighbourhoods, which are just another name for the rural health hubs that we proposed to government in 2019. And that I would remind this House were approved in the capital budget for the first time, Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago. This government is incapable of delivering anything on time, even when they're the ones setting the timelines. They sure do love to make announcements, Mr. Speaker. I'm all for recycling, but my God, how many times do we have to re-announce dental services or mobile mental health units or the health clinic? How far down the road is this government going to kick their promises in this budget? How many times, Mr. Speaker, are we going to have re-announcements on these promises before we begin to actually implement them? If this government is consistent about anything, it's their pattern of overpromising, under-delivering, and repeatedly announcing the same thing over and over when they delay rolling it out. So, Mr. Speaker, you'll understand why we have difficulty believing any promises they make in this budget. But you know what? These failures are not just limited to healthcare. Mr. Speaker, in the past years, we've seen this government fail to spend large portions of its housing budget in the middle of a housing crisis. Last year, they left more than $8 million of new housing build completely unspent from their capital budget, and they are currently overspending on roadworks by $7 million. They managed, in fact, to build 4 new roundabouts in District 9, but the government MLA, who's also a minister, is failing to address the rent evictions that are happening in her community. There There is always money for paving, but not for people, not with this government.
Maybe we're living on the bridge. Just want to sleep under the bridge.
Now, in this budget, we have investment for social housing renovations and construction. We absolutely need new investment into social housing. Non-market rentals are a key solution to providing affordable housing to islanders, and it is encouraging to see government growing more comfortable in intervening to address our housing crisis. Heck, it's encouraging to see them actually accept that there is a housing crisis, Mr. Speaker. But we also need this government to seriously address the issue of affordable housing being pulled off the market through short-term rentals and speculative activity. The impact of government's investments in social housing are seriously reduced and undermined when government isn't actively ensuring our housing market is working for everyday islanders. While I'm happy to see $24 million in this budget for social housing, I am disappointed that this investment is worth only half of what this government intends to spend on highways. It's an unmistakable pattern, Mr. Speaker. It speaks to a Conservative government that does not care about housing in our province, a government that's content to leave islanders at the mercy of the free market, and one that cannot shake its addiction to those sweet, sweet 50-cent federal dollars. And let's not forget, this government couldn't even get its act together enough to bother to apply for the millions of dollars of federal housing grants that were on offer in the middle of a housing crisis. Where are their real priorities? Similar to the housing file, this government has left millions of dollars of federal COVID funds unspent. These could have been used to, for example, provide proper ventilation and drinking water for every island school. They only changed their tune on drinking water when we asked questions about it in the House, and they're only now committing to put proper ventilation systems into those 10 island schools that don't have any, and that's going to take 2 more years. What happened to those federal funds you received in March that were specifically designed to make schools safer? Maybe they magically turned into paving dollars, Mr. Speaker. Talking about schools, this government continues to make promises and delay action on the construction of new schools to alleviate the real overcrowding in Charlottetown and Stratford. The Sherwood School is announced again, as it has been announced every year since 2017, during my by-election, you may recall, Mr. Speaker, but we've yet to see shovels in the ground there either, so you'll forgive me for being sceptical on commitment number 5. At this point, the community is prepared to provide their own shovels if it just means that finally something, anything, will get going at Sherwood School other than the sign that announces it is going to. And you don't get to announce a second net zero school in Stratford when you haven't started on the first one in Sherwood. It is critical that we invest in our children, and here on the official opposition side of the House, we know that access to affordable childcare is not only a social issue but an essential part of a strong provincial economy. With so many island institutions and businesses facing critical labour shortages, we need childcare so that new parents can return to the labour force as soon as they want to and are able to. This is especially the case in healthcare, where the workforce is still heavily dominated by women. This is why we requested that the government invest in the creation of new childcare facilities, in particular in or near health facilities. But it doesn't look like that's actually a priority for this government. As if we needed more examples of this government over-promising and under-delivering, we have maybe the biggest promise this government has made on climate change. We were told over a year ago that government would release a plan to reach net zero by 2040 and net zero in energy by 2030. There have been a couple of programs announced that will likely help, rural transit and EV incentives, but other than that, it's been crickets on how they plan to actually achieve these hugely transformative changes. Our caucus identified helping to make our communities more sustainable as a key priority for this budget. We asked for investments in demonstration projects for agrivoltaics and for renovating existing homes to net zero. With so many island homes still using oil for heating, there's also major spending needed here, Mr. Speaker, and there's nothing in this budget for these. We asked for investments in agri-foods and food inspection facilities, nothing. We asked for funding to support Inclusions East with the construction of their new facility in Brudenell, nothing. And Mr. Speaker, we're not able to say what has been allocated because while the Minister may be comfortable standing up and saying that they're going to meet a number of our commitments that we asked for, Mr. Speaker, we weren't informed. We didn't receive a briefing memo. We have no idea what details from the asks that we made as official opposition have been included. The only ones that we've heard about are in passing, Mr. Speaker, and they've been funded at a fraction of the ask. So you'll forgive me for my, my doubts about where the priorities actually lie. Maybe it's an indication of how little this government works with other parties these days, but there are several of our requests that we simply don't know where the government is funding. Many of these asks would provide an immediate and tangible benefit to islanders. Investments in outdoor recreation equipment, we asked for $1 million. We're hearing $100,000. I don't think that's going to cut it. Expansions in a number of emergency and transitional shelters, a restorative care unit at QEH, an expansion of detox facilities to address the increasing need for mental health and addiction services across the province. The devil is in the details, and I'm looking forward to speaking about these on the floor, but we just don't know what details are there. It's all promises, it's all talk, and no action. How government spends public funds is perhaps the most direct indication of what matters to that government. So we will also be looking to get a clear picture of the priorities and values that guide this government and this Premier. The constant announcements with no follow-through, Mr. Speaker, are hurting islanders. The missed deadlines that I've outlined are not just dates and dollars. These failures directly affect the lives of islanders. Islanders who are struggling with addiction or are watching their loved ones struggle with addiction and have no one to call for help. People who don't know where they're going to live next month because their rent is going up so high they can't afford to stay. Parents who are desperately trying to keep that stress away from their children, knowing they may have to switch schools to find housing or they have to live in their car. Many of our children are spending their days in overcrowded schools with inappropriate ventilation and access to water. This government promises to change that, and maybe by the time some of these students graduate, things will be different. But, Mr. Speaker, that's not good enough. People are living in despair because this government hasn't rolled out services that were promised years ago and that are so far overdue. Enough is enough. If this is actually about people, Mr. Speaker, it's time for this government to show it. In 2019, we could excuse some of these failures for this Conservative government because they were new to the job and we gave them space. In 2020, we gave them more space and the benefit of the doubt due to COVID. But now it's the third year on the job, Mr. Speaker, and they have run out of excuses and islanders have run out of patience.